So I started preparing an introduction for Terryl, and I realized, and wouldn't you imagine that the only time that our printers died were the night of an event, right? So we can't print anything except for from one computer, so my introduction will just have to be off the cuff here. But it's interesting because I went to all these websites that were introducing Terryl Givens, and basically it said he wrote a lot of books, right? And you guys can see an example on our counter here of a lot of the stuff he wrote in Mormon Studies. When we originally had this planned in August, one of our customers brought in a book that I had never seen before. And Terryl actually wrote a children's book, at least one, maybe two, that were from like the 80s. Is that right?
97.
97. That was like his family history kind of thing put into children's books. So Terrell's been at this a long time. I can remember when I was a young bookseller here at Benchmark Books, and By the Hand of Mormon came out, which was kind of the first book that got Terryl on the Mormon scene. He had other books previously, but that was kind of the one, right? That, and I remember thinking, now, who is this guy? You know, some of us were, back then we didn't have quite the communication we do now with all the different authors, and we thought, I wonder if he's a Mormon, because a lot of people thought, oh, you know, he could be this non-Mormon guy writing about Mormon things, and lo and behold, he was, and has elucidated us in many different topics, and we're grateful to have him here tonight. So I know that he is a fellow at the Neil Maxwell Institute and was previously a English professor at the University of Virginia, and I'm sorry I don't remember the name of the chair that you had there, but it was a prestigious one. And according to his website, he's published 21 books. Is that still the case, or is this 22 here?
It'll be 22 next week.
22 next week. That's amazing. Now here's the thing, we are lucky enough to have a lot of different people come through Benchmark Books. And a big part of that was because they love my dad, right? But a couple weeks ago, Bob Millett came by to pay his respects and to talk to us and so on. And he actually bought a couple of your books, Terryl, I'll let you know. But somebody, in fact, was it Craig, was it you that asked him how many books he'd written? Somebody that was one of our customers went up to him and said, I'd like to know how many books have you been a part of in your career? Anybody want to guess how many books Bob Millett's been a part of?
50.
Okay, not quite 100. It was 81. 81 books that he had either been a part of or authored himself, and he said he still had a number of them in the works. In fact, it's funny, he said, I still have 2 or 3 I want to publish right before I die because there's stuff in there that I don't want to be around for when people read. But anyway, so Terryl, you got 60 more to go. You got a few years. You can catch up, I'm sure. Anyway, we're so grateful that he could be here tonight and talk about a couple of his new books, which I guess I ought to tell you about. Thank you. I'm going to go back to this one too. So there's a new publisher that hit the world of Mormonism right when COVID was hitting, called Faith. Thank you. Faith Matters. You may be familiar with it. They do podcasts and seminars and speaking engagements that Terrell's been a part of as well as others. And they published a great book co-authored with Fiona called All Things New, Rethinking Sin, Salvation, and Everything in Between. And then earlier this year, we have this new biography, Stretching the Heavens, The Life of Eugene England and the Crisis of Modern Mormonism. And then finally, Yet to be Revealed, Open Questions in Latter-day Saint Theology, edited by Terryl and Eric Eliason. And so we're so grateful that he could be here tonight to discuss his books with us and maybe tell us about some future projects. And one question I'm going to ask from the beginning that I saw on your website, it said that you like to reconstruct the library of Joseph Smith. I'd love to hear about what that means. If you'll join with me in welcoming Terryl Givens, please turn off your cell phones and know that this is being recorded, will be broadcast shortly after.
Well, I, like many of yourselves, had a great love for Kurt, and I'm happy for the legacy that he's left behind. Some of you may not know that, can you hear me? Is that not broadcasting yet? Can you turn it up, or do I need to just hold it here?
Should work
Just
on
get
here.
it to my lip.
Let's see, did it? Fast, did it turn on?
I think you blew the speaker on it.
No, let me see that real quick.
Maybe I turned it off. So it's on.
Testing. Test. Oh, it's on mute. There we go.
Okay, we'll try that. Is that better? Can you hear me now in the back?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Thanks. So, you probably don't know that I twice dropped out of graduate school in order to partner with my father in the book business. So I couldn't make up my mind for many years which of those lives I was going to pursue. So there's no happier venue for me than to be in a bookstore speaking on books to people who love books. So it's good to be here. As far as the question about Joseph Smith's library, work was done by Kenneth Godfrey, and I think subsequent work by others has tried to reconstitute what we know about the personal library of Joseph Smith, most of which books he donated to the Nauvoo Library. So I don't know, we have a list of maybe 30 or 40 books. And so, yeah, one of my hobbies is to go online and see if I can track down copies of the same editions, the same printings of the books that he owned in his library. And I'm about halfway there. And I also try to collect books that I'm convinced he personally read and was influenced by. And I think a case can be made for any number, 5 or 6 books from that era. So those are all part of this library. I don't know what its destiny will be, but I've got it in my office. I don't have a prepared presentation. I'm happy to talk about any of these books or projects yet to come. Let me just say a few words about the background of these 3 books, and then we can go any direction that you'd like. I'll speak first about Yet to be Revealed. This is a project that I undertook with Eric Eliason. It was actually at his initiative. And I think the most important thing about this collection of essays, we edited a collection of essays by, 20 or 25 Latter-day Saint scholars on a variety of topics, all of which are unresolved in terms of official church doctrine, but most of which people think have been resolved one way or the other. I'm reminded of the anecdote that may or may not be true about President Hinckley, who is reported to have said to some of his brethren, "I wish that we apostles had as much certainty about gospel truths as your typical Wasatch Front high priest quorum." And so much of what we were trying to accomplish, the central purpose in this collection, was for us to celebrate the indeterminacy of much of Latter-day Saint doctrine. Because if we take seriously the proposition that there is much to be revealed, then we ought to be glad and celebrate the fact that we are in a vibrant, dynamic tradition where much is unknown, and we are free to speculate or to ponder or to wait patiently for other truths to be clarified or revealed. So that was the genesis of that book, and we completed it about 2 years ago. And it waited almost that entire time in the hands of BYU administrators because being published by BYU Press, it had to go through BYU administrative channels. So that's the reason for that delay. All Things New was written at the request of the Faith Matters people who wanted to start their own publishing line, and it seemed that Fiona and I had reached a point in our partnership, our collaborative work, that we felt we could do a kind of synthesis of much of our work in a more organized, systematic way. I guess the principal thrust of which is to try to reconstitute more holistically what we understand to be Joseph Smith's original comprehensive vision of the gospel. So that was a primary intent, and the secondary intent was probably to try to track the history of our religious vocabulary to document the extent to which we feel it has been contaminated and continues to be contaminated by a Protestant inheritance that is so pervasive in our culture that even as Latter-day Saints, we continue to labor under what Joseph Smith referred to in, was it section 123 or 127? He referred to as the chains and fetters of hell that bind us to these creedal traditions. And so that's a work of creative reconstitution in which we think we are doing our best to clarify the restoration doctrine, not invent or create new ones, but to sift through the cultural baggage that our tradition has acquired, as is inevitably the case with culturally formed institutions, even if they are divinely instituted. So a few words about the Gene England biography. Gene died in 2001. I knew him passingly. I was only coming to know Gene England, so I counted it as a great personal loss that this budding relationship that I was forming, more in the nature of a kind of disciple, mentor, was abruptly terminated, as tragically as it was. I did not know his wife, Charlotte, but she had become acquainted with some of my work, and so just a few years after his death, she approached me and asked if I would be willing to write his biography. I didn't want to do that for a number of reasons. One, because I was young and just an assistant professor. I had my own projects and didn't feel I was of the right generation. I felt that his story needed to be told by somebody of his own era. Second, I knew that it was perilous waters to be swimming in. And I continued to feel that way for the next several years, and in some ways still do. There are very few people who are neutral about Gene England, who know him and his work. People saw him as a provocateur and a malcontent, or they saw him as a martyr and a victim. And so I increasingly was made aware of this prevailing sentiment that wanted to see him as either a bad guy or as a martyr crucified at the hands of an unscrupulous authoritative regime. And it took a number of years before I felt that there might be ways of navigating that safely, based in part on his love for King Lear, which he thought was, I think, the greatest work ever written. And of course, it is Shakespeare's greatest tragedy. And in my understanding of tragedy, and as I have studied and taught the tragic as a genre over the years, I believe in the definition of a tragic universe that was propounded by the philosopher Hegel, who said we live in a tragic universe because it means that absolute qualities and virtues are going to come into conflict with each other. And the result is always the conflict of the good versus the good. And one of those goods has to suffer. And so I don't think there were any bad guys in the story of Gene England's life. I think there were competing imperatives, competing values and paradigms that came into tragic collision. And I think ultimately tragedy sometimes requires a sacrificial victim to validate the values for which that person lived and died. And so I think there is a kind of poignant validation of the kind of discipleship that Gene England stood for that was borne out by the way in which he died, feeling in many ways alienated and estranged from the institution that he so loved. I want to say just a few words as well about the subtitle of the book. A couple of things about that subtitle, The Crisis of Modern Mormonism. First of all, I don't like the word crisis, but every publisher wants crisis in the title. And of course, in deference to President Nelson, I asked them to substitute a word for Mormonism, but publishers are resistant to do that, and this was under contract long before that dictate was ever made. But one other point about this, the subtitle says The Crisis of Modern Mormonism. That's not really what this story is about. It's actually about the crisis of Mormon modernism. And I'm not just playing word games, so let me say a little bit about what I mean by that. And to my mind, all of our lives warrant a narrative. So what makes one person's life more worth narrating than another's? And in Gene's case, at least in part, I think it was the fact that his life was a window into a particularly vexed and tumultuous era in Latter-day Saint history. And what he experienced, the vortex in which he was caught up, was a 75-year delayed crisis of modernism. So modernism, in a religious historical context, refers to the crisis that was precipitated by what is generally referred to as the birth of a kind of historical consciousness in religious studies. And what that means is simply this, that precipitated by such events as Darwin's theory of evolutionary biology, before that Lyell's writings on geology, which established beyond any reasonable doubt the antiquity of the Earth dating back millions of years, and then finally the birth of higher criticism in Germany in the 19th century and then going into the 20th. What we have is a collective of issues, discoveries, developments that make even the devout acutely aware of the influence of history in the constituting of religious institutions and the constituting of religious scripture, of canons of scripture. There is, to this day, in a certain kind of religious imagination, right, a kind of ahistoricity to the scriptures, right? The scriptures don't come out of a moment in time, they're transcendent, right? They speak timelessly and eternally. And as the work of reconstructing the textual history of the Old and New Testaments alike transpired via the higher criticism, it became impossible to sustain that myth. And so the question then comes to the fore in both Protestant and Catholic traditions: how do we reconcile the human element in the constituting of Scripture and institutions with our desire to believe in a kind of divine eternalism and inspiration behind these? And so Catholicism is resilient enough as an institution by the 1900s and teens that it doesn't fracture into various denominations or subsects, but nevertheless there are papal bulls that are issued on the subject of modernism. It is declared a heresy, the consummate heresy of the age. There are loyalty tests that are administered in Catholic seminaries that priests have to attest to their resistance of and denial of modernist teachings. Meanwhile, in the Protestant tradition, we get a kind of fracturing between what's going to come to be liberal Protestantism on the one hand and a kind of fundamentalism on the other. And there is no Christian, no denomination that is untouched by this modernist crisis of the 19 teens, except for Mormonism. And the question is why? And so this question lurks in the background of this narrative of Eugene England's life, because I think in large measure it is the only historical context in which we can make full sense of the kinds of conflicts, contestations that he is victim of. So let me just summarize what I mean by a couple of those reasons for the deferral of this crisis. First of all, Latter-day Saints don't have theology schools or seminaries. So we don't send our leaders to be trained and versed in contemporary developments in biblical scholarship. So we're immunized from all of that. We have a conception of prophetic authority that for 100 years and more has largely been interpreted as inconsistent with theology itself, right? I can't trace the quote, but secondhand it's been reported that Hugh Nibley once said, "Theology is what happens when revelation fails." I hope he didn't really say that, because that would be one of the worst things he ever said. But, Wilford Woodruff referred to it as the greatest tomfoolery in the world. I don't think it's coincidence that the lectures on faith are called the lectures on faith when Joseph Smith called them the lectures on theology. There was a theology department at Brigham Young Academy, but it's fallen into disfavor because theology is, and to some extent to the present day, continues to be seen as a threat to or a challenge to church doctrine and teachings. That, I think, is truly lamentable. and almost tragic. The Catholics have a really clear understanding. There is dogma, which is belief you are required to assent to be a member in good standing. There is doctrine, which is the normative teaching of the church. And there is theology, which is the intellectual and thoughtful exposition of the implications and ramifications and grounding of doctrine. So there isn't any conflict in the Catholic tradition. Theologians understand their position in relationship to authoritative teachings. But those lines haven't been clearly delineated in the LDS tradition. So to take one example of a tragic consequence of this is in one of many of Eugene England's confrontations with the church leadership, he had published an article which he introduced with the sentence, "This is an essay in speculative theology." And he was summoned by the leadership and he was explicitly told, "You are not to do speculative theology." So no explanation given. It just seems self-evident that you don't have priesthood authority, so you have no business as a theologian, speculative or otherwise. So Eugene England is coming of intellectual age at a moment when the modernist crisis is finally unfolding in the Latter-day Saint setting for a number of reasons. One reason, because in the 1930s, the church sent a number of BYU professors of religion to the Chicago Divinity School so that they could be versed in these developments. And what happened as a result? Some of them come back to BYU, converted liberal Protestants. So that program is shut down immediately. The internet occurs, and suddenly the church can no longer control the archives and the access to original sources. Many people don't realize that Eugene England's first employment in Utah was in the historian's office, working very closely with Leonard Arrington and doing research into original primary sources, principally in the life of Brigham Young. So he's exposed to, he's immersed in this wealth of sources. The new Mormon history is coming on the scene, where for the first time we are professionalizing the study of history in the Latter-day Saint tradition. And so what is coming to be discovered? Oh, the narrative is actually a lot more complicated than the church manuals would have it. And so Eugene England is kind of the tip of the spear in some ways of this dawning recognition of what's coming down the pike in terms of an impending crisis between sanitized, faith-building, streamlined narratives on the one hand, and a muddy, complicated, messy church history on the other. And so what does he take upon himself to do? Well, he wants to help resolve these tensions. And so he does this very self-consciously and very explicitly, such as in his celebrated 1979 talk, where he tries to bring together the disparate views of God as a progressive being and God as a being who is omniscient and omnipotent in the classical ways. And he's a creature born out of time, in other words. He and his setting are in every way reminiscent of the struggles of the Protestants and Catholics in the 19-teens, aughts and teens. Now it's happening in a way that many in the church are not prepared for. And Eugene England is just, I think, a little bit ahead of the curve. I've often been asked the question, how would he and his work be received in the church of 2021? And I say, well, it depends on what you mean by that question. Do you mean, where would he be in 2021 and how would that Eugene England be received? Or do you mean the Eugene England of 1970 and 80? Because the Eugene England of 1970 and 80 would be orthodox or in some ways regressive in today's church, right? He was barred from teaching religion courses at BYU because of his expressed sympathy for the plight of gay members of the church, for example. In no way did he even remotely challenge church teachings on homosexuality, but his mere expressions of sympathy were seen as provocative and dangerous in a way that banned him. Of course, he wasn't critical of the ban on priesthood. As far as I can see, I think sometimes that has been misrepresented, misunderstood. He was distressed by the priesthood ban. But I can't find any place where in public or in private he ever recorded his belief that it was uninspired. He always felt that the priesthood ban was a punishment to the white membership of the church for their racism, not of the blacks for their unworthiness. So in this and in other regards, I can't see that the Gene that we find in his writings would be out of harmony with church teachings or church culture today. He was just pretty far ahead of the curve. And I guess the strongest evidence I would give in support of that reading would be the 2017 talk of Elder Ballard, which I personally consider to be the most important talk of the last 50 years. Most people haven't heard it because it wasn't given in general conference. It was given in a worldwide address to CES educators. I would encourage everybody here to go and read that if you haven't, because the way I read that talk of Elder Ballard is as saying the charted course of church education, the landmark talk given by J. Reuben Clark back in was it 1937, I think, which still serves as a kind of manifesto of the CES. Elder Ballard stands up into a worldwide audience. He says that doesn't work anymore. We have failed, and he uses that language. We have failed to prepare our young people adequately for the challenges of today. And I think one of the most astonishing things that he said in that talk was to the church educators, he said, a testimony is not an appropriate response to a question. And if you don't know the answer that a student asks of you, then go to a church historian or somebody who does. So those are the kinds, right? That's the kind of sentiment that Eugene England was advocating for in the 1970s and 80s so unsuccessfully. So that's why I refer to the crisis of Mormon modernism that he lived through and experienced. I'm happy to take questions or go in any direction you'd like. Yeah?
Can you speak to Gene's atonement theology and its relative impact on the tensions that impacted his life?
Yes. It's hard to point. The question was to address Eugene England's atonement theology and its larger ramifications and repercussions. Everybody has their own special or favorite theory as to why eventually Eugene England is essentially dismissed from BYU. It's just a complex concatenation of lots of factors. But the one pervasive theme that finally blew up was his atonement theology. In an early edition of Dialogue, he published an essay called "That All Might Not Suffer," a theology of atonement. It's roughly the title. And in this theology, Eugene England is very self-consciously and explicitly bringing to the fore, resurrecting Abelard's theory of atonement, which was based on what the theologians call moral exemplariness theology. So if I can just do if you'll indulge me, can I give you a quick overview of the history of atonement theology, right? It begins as ransom theology in the Middle Ages, that we're all indebted, we're all in prison to Satan, and so Christ ransoms us by offering himself, but then lo and behold, Satan, when he discovers that Jesus is sinless, he can't maintain his hold on him, so he's deceived and we all get out. That later develops into satisfaction theology, which is based on a kind of the social structures of the medieval world, in which there are liege lords and serfs and peasants, and we all owe obeisance to this lord. We owe God, who is sovereign, a kind of honor and obedience. That's been violated. His honor has been offended, and so satisfaction has to be had by somebody suffering for that, and Christ steps into that. By the time of the Reformation, at the hands of Luther and Calvin in particular, that develops into penal substitution, which is a more legalistic rendering of that, which is to say there's a law, the law has been broken, somebody has to pay the penalty, and so Christ assumes that penalty, right? If you think about the church film strip we used to see in seminary, it's called The Mediator? Is that the one? About the moneylender and that. Okay, that's penal substitution theology. Most Christians today have abandoned penal substitution as kind of barbaric, and it also creates the dilemma of a God who is punitive and vindictive and a Christ who stands in opposition to that God and has to defend and protect us from God. Eugene England found our buying into that theology repugnant. We don't have an official theology of atonement, by the way, okay? There isn't any official LDS interpretation of atonement. So Gene tried to resurrect Abelard's theory of moral exemplariness, according to which it is purely the spectacle of this holy, innocent figure being crucified in our behalf that breaks our hearts and opens us to mercy and change. Okay, that's essentially the moral influence theory of atonement. It's a beautiful essay. I think he nails the affective efficacy of the atonement. In other words, he explains why the atonement can work upon us and change our hearts, why, in the words of the Book of Mormon, it can draw us to Christ. The problem, he sent copies of this essay to Boyd K. Packer and to Neal A. Maxwell. Neal A. Maxwell replied with one of the funniest put-downs in reader response criticism when he said, "I love everything about your essay, the only thing it's lacking is the truth." Or words to that effect, in inimitable Neal A. Maxwell style. But he made it clear, I don't think this is true or accurate. And we know that Boyd K. Packer also flat out rejected that as false teaching. Nevertheless, Eugene England persisted to teach that over and over and over again. He gave firesides on it. He was teaching it when he was a Sunday school teacher. 30 years later, he's still teaching that doctrine of atonement. Where it comes to a head is he receives a letter from his stake president in the 1980s, whose name happens to be, somebody help me here, President of BYU. Bateman. Happens to be President Bateman. And somebody complains that Gene is teaching this theology, that it's heretical. President Bateman says, well, you go sort it out with Gene. So Gene and this individual had to sort it through. The individual sends a report to President Bateman affirming that, yes, Eugene England admits that he is still teaching in defiance of penal substitution. Nothing further happens as far as I know, but then in 1996, 97, Eugene England is in the office of the newly installed President Bateman of BYU. They have a meeting. Eugene England records. He was just strangely icy cold to me, and I don't know why. But then he also remarks, as I was leaving his office, he asked me the strangest question. He said, by the way, what do you believe about the atonement? So clearly, in President Bateman's mind, is that Eugene England is still teaching, espousing this doctrine. Eugene England fails to make the connection that historically this has always been the thorn in the side of the brethren. Now, for a quick speculation as to why the brethren found that so problematic, it's because all four of the standard works use the language of substitution. And much as I personally, for example, speaking theologically, much as I love moral exemplary theology, there's nothing in moral exemplary theology that would explain why the atonement is universally necessary. The Dalai Lama doesn't need to have his heart broken. He's contrite. Mother Teresa didn't need to have her heart broken. She's holy. So see what I mean? There seems to, Eugene England explicitly denies there's any metaphysical dimension to the atonement. He doesn't think anything is happening in the cosmos. It's a purely kind of emotional, affective thing. And I'd like to believe that, but the scriptures seem to indicate otherwise. So. Yes?
One of the things I found really interesting in your Eugene England book is, of course, the story about McConkie writing a letter, and the letter gets released to the public and stuff like that. The provenance of that, it looks like it came from McConkie. He strikes me as a person who probably kept really good records. I was wondering if you have any knowledge as to when is there a McConkie collection of papers that are going to be released someday? Or, I know they're real tight about that.
Yeah, I haven't looked into that. I know there are other people who have other details and records about that exchange. I didn't delve into it any more deeply than I did. All the evidence that I've looked at makes it pretty clear by implication that somebody in Elder McConkie's office leaked the document. I don't think Elder McConkie was party to that. But clearly it was not Eugene England, because the leak occurred before he even received his own copy of the correspondence from Elder McConkie. He was abroad in England. So we know that it originated from somebody associated with Elder McConkie himself. And we're referring to the famous letter about the sword of justice hanging over Eugene England's head, and it is my province to speak authoritatively and your province to listen. And that was the letter that was made public. Yes?
What might be some of the more surprising theological questions that are not settled, that people would be surprised here are not settled in the church?
Well, you know, my favorite one is always, you know, the question of whether there is eternal progression for everyone concerned. Well, for everybody, for the entire human family. And so that was the essay that I actually wrote myself for this collection. And one interesting development, after the proofs were already printed, a discovery was made in the archives. It was actually Ben Spackman who discovered a correspondence originating from a translator of the Articles of Faith into German. And we discovered that we had all gotten the narrative a little bit wrong about James Talmage's position on progression through the kingdoms. And it turns out that James Talmage was not an apostle at the time he wrote the first edition of Articles of Faith. And his work, because it was commissioned by the church, it had to pass apostolic review. And in the first draft of the Articles of Faith, James Talmage denied that there was any progression through the kingdoms after judgment. And the Committee of Apostles required that he change that to say, yes, there is progression through the kingdoms. And so it was published in the first editions. And so we now know, as a matter of simple history, that at least around the year 1900, a majority of the apostles on the quorum affirmed and wanted it taught that there is continuing progression through the kingdoms. Nobody is permanently damned. 3 times subsequently, the first presidency issued a statement, identical language 3 times, that said there is no official position. And so that's one example. I mean, another essay would be, was Jesus married? Some of them are a little technical. Was the Deuteronomic reform under King Josiah a good thing? Or were the plain and precious things deleted at that stage in our history? Are we saved by grace or works? So it's a wide range, historical and theological alike. Yeah. Yes?
I found it interesting, Elder Rose's talk in recent conference about any church, and churches are great, any church is great. It sounded almost like a, not excerpt so much, but that before he wrote his talk, he read Eugene England's Why the Church is as True as the Gospel. And I just found it interesting that someone who had a somewhat antagonistic relationship with England now would give a talk that was largely in harmony with some very core beliefs of Gene as it related to just how connected everyone was independent.
Yeah. So let me say a little bit about this. And I should know this, but I can't remember if this last essay of Gene's was published before he died or not. But in one of his final essays, he's dealing directly with this problem of what he calls the uneconomy of God. And he's quite open about the fact that as a Latter-day Saint believer, he has never reconciled himself to the lack of economy. There's so few of us, and so many billions of them. And he was deeply impressed when he was a student at Stanford by one of his, now I've forgotten the name, but he was of the Presbyterian faith, and he was out of harmony with his own tradition because he was a universalist. I think it's a little sad that as good as a scholar and historian as Eugene England was, he doesn't seem to have been aware of the precedents in LDS thinking, especially with Joseph Smith himself, Brigham Young, Lorenzo Stone, many of the early brethren who were pretty explicit in affirming progression through the kingdoms. So he found that problematic. I think what we have seen in the last 20, 25 years, and this is just as a kind of observer of contemporary LDS history, is the notion of Zion is in process of, it seems to me, substantive redefinition. Right? Zion emerges in Latter-day Saint thinking as a uniquely Latter-day Saint kind of, right, institution. We're going to create Zion. People have to come and gather to Zion, figuratively or spiritually, but they've got to be members of the church to be part of Zion. And we don't hear that language anymore. And from people like Sharon Eubank, right, in her position, and from leaders in the apostles, we hear increasingly that no, Zion has to be this multicultural, multi-religious enterprise in which we play an important role, but others have their important roles to play as well. I think Eugene England would have been tremendously gratified to see this kind of shift in not just language, but I think shift in theological conceptualization of what Zion is. Yeah, and Elder Oaks' talk is an example of that. Yeah.
Well, kind of on the same topic, and you alluded to this earlier also, the church is in a, I guess it's the encounter with modernism that's really been giving headaches to the church and a lot of members of the church as they try to reconcile the information on the internet, and a lot of people are leaving the church and wrestling, and the church has made some big strides to try to accommodate that, to shift its narrative and its interpretation. If you got out your seer stone and peered down the road, where do you think the church needs to go to define a new way to interpret, I don't know, I guess it's encounter with modernism, and to get it home with that? Where are we going? Where do we need to go, do you think?
Okay. Everybody hear that question about where do we need to go, what problems are looming ahead, and how might we address problems that are continuing to unfold in modernism? So I'll make both a historical and a kind of speculative observation. Historically speaking, my wife and I have had a wonderful opportunity to travel a lot, giving firesides around the church, around the world. When we began doing this in 2012, the questions were overwhelmingly of a historical orientation. How do you explain multiple accounts of the first vision? And talk to me about polygamy, and why aren't we acknowledging this and that, right? None of those questions appear anywhere on the scene today, right? Because we've got the Gospel Topics pages now, we have the New Church History of the Saints, we have the Joseph Smith Papers. So, right, we're living in recent history through a major shift in what the major causes of disaffection are. There are surveys dating to about 10 years ago in which the number one issue cited for disaffection from the church was the Book of Abraham. Nobody's talking about the Book of Abraham anymore, right? At least not in that way. I think, LGBT, that's going to continue, right? Because we're still, we're working through that. And, I had an interview today with a scholar who's doing this interesting project on genealogy. So he wanted to talk, we talked for over an hour on the theology of genealogy. He wants to know, what is this all about? And what exactly is happening in your temples? And I said, well, to understand this, you have to understand, you can look at the church in terms of these phases. Think about this, right? Catherine Dames has documented that Joseph Smith experimented with Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, 7 different kinds of polygamy. We all think of it as this monolithic thing, right? 7 different varieties, right? And then, by the time Joseph dies, temple theology is completely oriented around dynastic sealings, right? You go to the temple, you have to be sealed to a prophet. Then in 1890, polygamy ends. What does that do to the way in we think about the organization of heaven? Then in 1894, President Woodruff stands up and says, we've been doing it all wrong, right? He used the word wrong. And I saw the revelation of the Lord came unto me, saying, henceforth let every child be sealed to his parent, and every parent to his child. So suddenly, the whole social order of heaven is reconstituted. And that continues until now, 2010, 2020, we're asking, okay, how do gay people, how do trans people fit into this? And so it's not like it's the first time that we've confronted this problem of how do we adjust our understanding of what Joseph Smith referred to as the sociality of heaven to accommodate growing consciousness and awareness of principles coming to be unfolded and revealed. So who knows where we're going to go next? But it seems that, okay, so I'm going to leave that aside now. So another area where I think changes are already afoot that I'm tracking and my research assistants are tracking is the shift in vocabulary that we're hearing from the pulpit. And I think in many cases it's indicative of a, I'd like to say, a fine-tuning of theology that has to do with the nature of sin and atonement and salvation. Count how many times in the last two conferences, for example, you've heard the word Christ the healer, right? Elder Rasband gave what I think is the most beautiful talk on atonement I've heard in the last 20 years. And it was all about Christ as the healer. It doesn't mean that we're abandoning our ideas about sin, but it means that we are shifting a vocabulary that is more resonant, I also think more accurate, that I think has to happen if we're not going to continue to experience, right? You talk about pandemics, right? The pandemic of scrupulosity, of pathological scrupulosity. Talk to any counselor in the church. So I see those changes as really hopeful and necessary and providential. I think, you know, we need to take seriously the language of section 1, verse 24, when the Lord is talking about the kind of language that he uses. And look carefully at what he says. He says, right, I speak to people according to their language. Right?
Their understanding.
And their understanding. He doesn't speak according to his language. No, he's talking to us all the time according to our language. And our language shifts. And our understanding shifts. And so I think that's not just cosmetic. I think this is really deep, these changes. You know, you ask, at least in my experience, right, we've all got people who have left the church, right? All of us have family, friends, relatives. And I'm not going to reduce it to a single cause. They're infinite. But certainly one of the most common, if not the most common, is I'm just tired of feeling oppressed and constrained and bad about myself all the time. And it's not the historical problems anymore. It's not women in the priesthood. No, it's this language of condemnation and retribution and judgment. So,
What's the difference between language and understanding?
yeah.
I mean, what is the difference?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, let's consider this, right? We're all presentists, right? It's the crime of our age. It's been the crime of every age. We evaluate all the past through the lens of our moral understanding. We always assume we're finally there, right? We've arrived at a plenitude of moral inspiration and enlightenment. But if you think that for all the way through Joseph Smith's lifetime, people were holding other human beings as chattel. Women were treated as objects. Wars of conquest were celebrated and glorified. Right? We could go on and on and on. I don't want to sound like a progressive here, but you know, we have been a pretty lousy group of people as human beings through most of human history. And so the language, it seems to me, was shaped accordingly because we had a certain understanding, a certain conceptual vocabulary. And so that's why God says in section 19, yeah, sometimes I had to threaten people with eternal pain to work upon their hearts. Well, hopefully we're achieving a place in our moral evolution where we don't always require that same kind of language of threats and retribution and punishment. Not that we've arrived yet, but we're moving closer, we hope.
Forgive me, this is be kind of a convoluted question because I got a lot of ideas circling in my brain. But, so you've written, I think it was in the Pearl of Greatest Christ, about Joseph Smith's religion making as kind of a bricolage, right? In context of what we've been talking about tonight about how, you know, like in atonement theology, the history of atonement theology, how it's heavily influenced by the society in which it was born. You know, it seems like a lot of the topic we've been talking about tonight is like Orthodoxy seems to be at the heart of a lot of problems we have as Latter-day Saints. And I'm curious whether or not Orthodoxy has a place, right? I mean, maybe I've inferred incorrectly from a lot of things you personally have written and others, but that seemed to kind of be what Joseph Smith was trying to root out of his converts, right? Was loyalty to certain ideas. And I think you can also see that in Christ's contempt for religious leaders of his day too, right? So I was curious if you could speak to that in light of some of the things we've been talking about tonight. What place does Orthodoxy have?
Okay. I'm going to pretend I'm a politician and that I heard a slightly different question.
That's fine. You probably heard the version that was better articulated than the one I just got.
No, so I'm going to ask the question, what place do things like historical propositions and claims have in our faith? What do we need to be able to stand up and say, I know this happened, or I know this is true, right? I remember when I attended a Mormon History Association conference way back around 2000, and Grant McMurtry, do I have that name right? McMurray, president of the Reorganized Church. I'll never forget his keynote address. He said, history as theology is perilous. We've got to stop predicating our theology on history. And while that has a certain appeal, but do you really have to believe that on a particular day, when a clock is actually ticking in the background, and people are going to market, and the sun comes up and goes down, it's an actual lived day, and somewhere over in Palestine, Jesus resumes his body and literally rises from the dead? Do you have to believe that as a historical fact to be a Christian? I think you do. I think you do. So to say that we can just, that, history as theology is perilous, well, of course it's perilous. All faith is perilous. It's risky. But the question is, what historical details are non-negotiable? What did Joseph Smith think you had to believe in order to have that faith unto salvation, right? Now, I don't know, but I think our problem today is that we overbelieve way more than we underbelieve. I think our problem is that we define orthodoxy, and that's why we did this book, right? Is just as kind of a hint, an illustration of how much we don't know that we think we do. But I think there are just a few fundamental faith propositions that are non-negotiable. Christ really did rise from the dead. Joseph really did have an encounter with God in the sacred grove. And actual beings really transmitted to him actual keys that empower us to concretize and eternalize relationships. I mean, for me, those are the three non-negotiables. But you're absolutely right that Joseph bridled at litmus tests and doctrinal purity, and right, he's on record again and again and again as saying, it sounds too much like the Methodists, right? He would say, who have a creed you have to believe. And he hated creeds, right? And we keep reinventing them now. Yeah.
I wonder if the problem is less like just orthodoxy, but how we approach pluralism and just monoliths. Because I don't think the LDS Church is a monolith. But I was talking to this guy today on TikTok. He's an ex-Mormon, right? And he's talking about how Fawn Brody's the best biographer of Joseph Smith, and I'm like, that's 60 years out of date. Like, there's Bushman. If you're anti, there's still Vogel. There's Hill, who's still kind of old, but I think the problem might not be when it comes to the things, not orthodoxy, but dogmatic.
Okay. So let me say a little bit more about this then. What is the relationship between orthodoxy and orthopraxy? Because, right, I mean, is Jewel right? Does only kindness matter, ultimately? It's hard to argue that right belief is more important than right conduct, right? So how do we resolve this? What is the importance of orthodoxy? And I would say this, go back and read what Francine Benyon says about theology. She was our greatest theologian, I think, of recent memory. She gives this magnificent essay about theology, and she says, theology matters because theology conditions how you see others, and how you see yourself, and how you see God. So I want to make sure I assert that I think the reason theology matters, doctrine matters, is not so that we get it right? Like in the, what is that, that comic thing where, yep, it was the Mormons. Oh no, the Mormons? South Park, yeah. I don't think in the South Park kind of way. It's about getting the right answers. But see, here's the thing. What's the most important thing that Joseph learns theologically in his first vision? Right? Is it a doctrine? Well, kind of. It's about relationships. Yeah, I wish we canonized the 1832 version instead of the 1838 version. Because in the 1832 version, he comes out of that woods going, I just encountered Jesus, and he forgave me. And then he writes how he was filled with this love for days afterwards. Now, is that theology? Yes. What he learned for himself was, no, it's a real personal God. His love is absolute. He's not a sovereign Lord requiring obeisance, right? And so when we read Moses 7, I think that's the most profound theological contribution of the Restoration in some ways. It's deeply theological, but it forever changes how you pray, how you think about God, how you see others. When you see your God weeping over human misery instead of throwing lightning bolts. So, yeah, that's a false dichotomy. We can't keep going orthodoxy, orthopraxy. No, they're integrally related.
Just one last one. I know you want to wrap this up. As I think about all your works and your books, which do you feel is your most important work and why?
Thank you for that question. What do I think is my most important work and why? It's, which is the most important child that you cite? I will say this, and it's a personal question, and so I thank you, and I hope you'll indulge a personal answer to that. I see my life as having two major trajectories professionally. The first aspiration that I had is I wanted the academic world to take Mormonism seriously. And so that's what I was trying to do with books like A Viper on the Hearth and By the Hand of Mormon and the two histories of LDS theology. And, nobody's going to accomplish that single-handedly, but I hope that I've contributed to helping other religious scholars to see, we got to take these guys seriously, they deserve a place at the table. And then, as I turn to a more devotional audience, I think with a book like The God Who Weeps, I hope that I have helped us all not to be better apologists of the gospel, but to be better celebrants of the gospel and understand how profoundly, radically resonant and different our restored doctrines are. So those would be my two things.
Can I just follow up with that? When I talked to Brother Millett, and as he went on the circuit and with the other Christian scholars, and they would have their debates, and LDS people would come, and the Christian would come. And I asked him, you've gone through a lot of these now, and you're good friends with them. What's the result? I'd be interested to know how many of them converted to us, and how many of us converted to them. And do you know what his answer was?
I assume none.
He said 50-50. He said,
Yeah.
part of ours went over to their side and vice versa. And you've had some pretty scholarly jobs and associations. How has it been there? Have you seen people more drawn to the LDS Church? Or what's your feelings as you've been around and talked to those good Christians? And
Well, most academics I associate with aren't interested in converting in any direction. So I don't think those aren't any of the fruits that I have seen. What I have seen, I think, is, a Jewish writer once commented, looking at the Latter-day Saint predicament in American culture, he said, Mormons are the last group that it's socially acceptable to stigmatize. Right? And I think that's becoming less and less the case. So my experience has been that there is a plethora. Now, I just came back a few weeks ago from a Book of Mormon conference in Logan. And I can't say most of the scholars there, but the president of the Book of Mormon I don't know what it's called, Book of Mormon Studies Association, is a Pentecostalist. And two or three of the more prominent speakers at the conference were atheists or Protestants. So we've got a whole range of people now that are studying the Latter-day Saint phenomenon in a much more respectful and interested, inquiring way. So that's developed just in my professional career.
Just to follow up on that with an anecdotal observation from TikTok, I see a lot of the Protestants on TikTok communicate with Latter-day Saints, and most of it is the same conversation from 100 years ago. A lot of it's anti, a lot of it's poorly formulated thoughts. But as you can see from Millet, as you can see from Gaskill, all of these, there's the really good volume where they talk to progressive Christianity members. All of those movements are only increasing. So on an academic side, I would say that we're making a lot of headway. But on the lay, like, I'm 27, so I'm pretty young. On my end of the spectrum, there's a lot of still talking past each other. That's all TikTok is, it's just people talking past each other. So.
Well, I don't want to exhaust your patience, so I think, unless there's one final question, otherwise, one final question from the back.
I just wanted to comment. About 3 or 4 weeks ago, there was a beautiful BYU forum lecture by a Dr. Andrew Teal from Oxford University, who had been invited to BYU as a visiting professor by Elder Holland. That was a beautiful, beautiful talk. His theme was building the beloved community, meaning Christians learning how to respect and appreciate, the goodness in other people.
Yeah.
And just building that community.
Yeah, Andrew Teal is a chaplain and a lecturer in theology at Pembroke College at University of Oxford. His office was next to mine for the 6 months that he was here. He was a visiting scholar at the Maxwell Institute. We hope he comes back next year or the year after. He and I are currently planning a research seminar for Latter-day Saint and other scholars to be held at Oxford, in which we will hope to do a lot of interdenominational conversation. But he's a wonderful friend of the church and a wonderful Christian.
It was a beautiful talk. You can easily find it on
it was,
BYU
devotional.
speeches or even on YouTube. Just beautiful.
Right. Thanks very much. I'll hang around if there are other questions individually.